Matt Motyl is an assistant professor in the social and personality area of the psychology department and holds a courtesy appointment in the political science department at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Matt is a political psychologist and co-director of civilpolitics.org. He has his bachelor's degree of science from Allegheny College, which he received in 2006, and a master's of arts degree in experimental psychology from the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs, which he received in 2009. His doctor of philosophy and social psychology came from the University of Virginia in 2014. Matt studies why people struggle to communicate with people who hold different moral, political, or religious beliefs. One factor, actually I'm not going to tell you those factors because he's going to tell you, I'm going to skip that part. Matt is an author on more than 40 peer-reviewed scientific articles and book chapters, appearing in top peer-reviewed psychology, political science, and terrorism studies journals and books. His research has been featured in many popular media outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, Newsweek, Time Magazine, Mother Jones, Science Nature, and on CBS, BBC World, and NPR. Please join me in welcoming Matt.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to share some of my work with you. Now today, I'm going to start by kind of giving you a quick history of polarization and civility in this country. And I'll start by going to the 1960 election when John Wayne said, the Duke, said, I may not have voted for him, but he's my president and I hope he does a good job. Yet, if you fast forward to 2008, Rush Limbaugh famously said, I hope he fails. Now, this seemed pretty terrible at the time, pretty uncivil, and then you fast forward a couple more years into 2012, and then you have Barack Obama saying, you go into these small towns, and like a lot of small towns in the Midwest, the jobs have been gone for now 25 years and nothing's replaced them, and it's not surprising that they get bitter and they cling to guns and religion or antipathy toward people who aren't like them, or anti-immigrant sentiment, or anti-trade sentiment as a way to explain their frustrations away. This drew a lot of ire. And on the other side, we had Mitt Romney making the famous 47% comment saying there are 47% of people who will vote for the president no matter what, for President Obama no matter what, who are dependent on government, who believe that they are victims, those people who pay no income tax. And so my job is not to worry about those people. I'll never convince them. And oddly, this is actually pretty, it's a little bit hyperbole, but from political science, it's more or less correct. About probably 40% of people are not persuadable for either side. But he drew a lot of criticism for this comment. And we thought, okay, this is pretty bad. It's not going to get worse, right? Fast forward to this year. Where you have Hillary Clinton saying you could put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables, right? The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. And unfortunately, there are people like that, and he's lifted them up. And he has given voice to their websites. Now, some of these folks, they are irredeemable, but thankfully, they are not America. And then on the other side, you have Donald Trump saying, Hillary wants to essentially abolish the Second Amendment. By the way, if she gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks. Although maybe you Second Amendment people can. So here, it's not just saying, oh, well, I can't even persuade this group of people. It's, hey, well, maybe we could stop her by killing her, is the implication. And then if we just want to look at something simpler, just in the most recent debate, he says, she's such a nasty woman, interjects during her closing statement saying, she's such a nasty woman. And this isn't policy related, there's nothing there. I mean, if you look at Hillary's statement, same thing. There's no policy, it's just, they're evil and deplorable and unredeemable. So there's seems to be this rising demonization of people unlike us, and our discussion of politics is not so much about politics anymore. It's about how bad they are and how wonderful, how moral, how great we are. And it's even manifested in contexts where even though it's pretty rare that we see compromise or people working across the aisle anymore, when you do, you see here we had Chris Christie and Obama working to deal with a disaster of a hurricane, and you have lots of media coverage saying, is Chris Christie a traitor? He worked with the president to help people that had their houses ruined and destroyed by a terrible hurricane? Just because he worked with the president to handle a disaster? Wow, okay, that's not good. We can also point to lots of examples from day-to-day lives. So if you watch any of the media, you have people on the right calling people on the left the worst person in the world. And then for a while Keith Olbermann had a TV show, he had a section that was called The World's Worst, and he would rank the world's worst people of the day or the week. And here, of course, he's got Rush Limbaugh as the worst person in the world. We also have people yelling at our representatives. This is Senator Arlen Specter from Pennsylvania, and people got up in his face saying, no, you can't support the Affordable Care Act. And then instead of not just yelling at our politicians, but just yelling, we yell a lot. If you look back at the town halls that we had as we were debating reforming healthcare back in 2008 through 2009 or so, people were getting into lots of scuffles at these rallies and town halls. And the protests at different events, even just when the president would go somewhere and speak, they say some really nasty things, saying, abort Obama. Some people are opposed to these. Presumably, this person is opposed to partial birth abortion, but they're not opposed to post-birth abortion. So that's really offensive. And then you even have this guy who was carrying an AK-47 assault rifle saying it's time to water the tree of liberty. And the second half of that quote from Jefferson is with the blood of tyrants. So the guy shows up with an AK-47 at the president speaking, saying, we need to water the tree of liberty with the blood of tyrants. Wow, this seems unprecedented. And then at another town hall, there was even a guy who got into a fight with another person at the rally, had his pinky bitten off. And he's on Fox News here saying, you bit my finger off. So this is not the way dialogue is supposed to happen. When I'm talking to somebody, there's an expectation that they're not going to bite my finger off. But that expectation seems like it might be somewhat unfounded or wavering now. Okay, so I've pointed to lots of anecdotes, and you might say, oh, I'm not convinced. That's anecdotes. It's easy to cherry pick any of those things and make any argument you want. All right, well, fine. Let's talk about some data. So one piece of data is looking at polarization in Congress. And here, I've just plotted our capability of predicting how somebody within Congress is going to vote based on their party membership. So generally, you see, we could predict back in the wake of the Civil War, like party told us a lot. Like we knew Democrats were going to vote one way, Republicans were going to vote another way. And then it became less predictive, like right around World War II through the kind of the 1950s is a time when we think of kind of quaint American politics, very civil and the golden days. And it's true, we were less polarized in the 40s and 50s. But in recent years, we see this uptick where we've become more and more polarized from this, really the late 60s through today. Now, this trend is kind of it's positive, it's becoming more and more, but what happens in the last decade or so? It spikes even more. So we're now more polarized than we were after the Civil War. That's pretty intense. Okay, but that's just the elites. Those are the people that we elect, and they might have agendas, and there are certain pressures that make them vote certain ways. There's lots of money involved, and if they want to keep their office, maybe they have to vote that way. So maybe we want to look at you and me, regular people, the citizens of America. So we can look at polarization across different social groups. So here, you can basically take any social issue, and then here it's broken down by group. So when it says gender, this means how do the typical opinions of men versus women differ? And if you take basically any attitude issue that has been used in this Pew study, you see that men and women, they differed by about 4 points in 1987, and by 2012 is 6 points. So it's a little bit higher, but not really much. It's pretty much stable. And you see that people of different religions, they disagree on some issues, income a little more, education, race, like all that makes sense. But the disagreement is by far greater when we're looking at political party. So there's a bigger chasm between Democrats and Republicans than there are between any of these other social groups. And this is the one that has actually increased over the last 30 years in these data. And I only have data going through 2012 right now, but if you update it for this election, it's only going to be worse. Okay, so that's one way to look at polarization of our attitudes. But when we think about the motivation to bite somebody's finger off or yell at them, it's not disagreeing about policy. It's disliking them. You have to have some kind of animosity for somebody if you're going to do something so horrible to them. So we can look at liking and how much we like people like us versus people that are different from us. And political scientists, they call this affective polarization. So here, these top lines are how much I like people in my party. And generally, Democrats like Democrats, and Republicans like Republicans. This is a general tendency. When we're in a group, we like that group more. It makes perfect sense. That's why we're in that group, because we like it. And we generally like other groups that we're not a member of less. So the Republicans like Democrats less than they like them, their own type, and Democrats also like Republicans less than they like fellow Democrats. Now, this gap is more or less stable from Carter to Clinton, and it's kind of in the middle of the scale here. So, I should say that this y-axis here is what we call a feeling thermometer. So if you have a score of 0, it's like, I feel really cold, I don't like this person, this is not somebody that I'd want to associate with, I won't want to be friends with them. And if you say 100 on this scale, it says, oh, I'm really warm towards this person, I like this person a lot. So you see people pretty warm towards their own side, not terribly cold toward the other side, but not warm. There's definitely a difference between these two. Now, what happens following George W. Bush and into the Obama term? We see that there's another drop off. So in addition to becoming more polarized on political issues by our party, we are also becoming more polarized in how we feel about our party versus the other party. So not only do we disagree more, we dislike them more, and we like ourselves basically the same as we always have, but our attitude toward the other side is really going down. Okay, so today, I really want to try to answer the question, why on earth is this happening? And I think one of the keys that we need to understand in trying to make sense of this growing polarization and growing hostility towards people that are different from us is looking at our geography, looking at our context, looking at the communities in which we live and what is happening in those communities and how that might lead us to be more hostile towards other people or hold more extreme viewpoints on particular issues. So we often see these red and blue maps every 4 years, although it seems more and more frequent now because we're constantly campaigning and dealing with election cycles. And you kind of see, okay, sometimes this is called Jesus Land, or Michelle Bachmann famously said, oh, this is real America. And then sometimes people call this United States of Canada. But you have these two different clusters, and I actually really dislike these maps because it's very generic. I mean, it could be 51% of people in the state voting one way and 49 voting the other, and you still have people interacting with each other. But there's something more going on than just, oh, my state leaned one way or the other. And what we can look at is actually how segregated we're becoming in our politics. So this right here is a density map where we see the percentage of people or the different counties where people lived that were decided by less than 20 percentage points or more than 20 percentage points for one party or the other. Now, political scientists, they decide that a competitive election is anything decided by less than 20 points. So that's kind of a big gap, I think. But here, the areas printed in blue, that's where the Democrats won by more than 20 points. Areas in red, that's where the Republicans won by more than 20 points. And this was back in 1976. About 70% of people lived in a competitive district back in the 70s. Now, we fast forward to today, 19% of people live in a competitive district. So almost everybody is living in an enclave. They're living in an ideologically segregated community where they don't interact with too many people that have dissimilar viewpoints. We don't know them. We live in different places. We have different life experiences. And this is growing over time. Okay. Now, this is one type of segregation. This is just simple geographic segregation. But it's not just geographic segregation that we're seeing now. Here, this is an awful image, but this is one analysis looking at bills written in Congress and who they were co-authored by. So these gray lines connect different, so the blue dots are Democratic people in Congress, the red dots are Republican people in Congress, and then the gray lines connecting them are the people that you co-author bills with. So you see a line between this person and this person, then they co-authored something together. Now, in 1950, you see that there's lots of gray lines going all over the place. Everybody's co-authoring bills with everybody else. Now, in 1977, you start seeing that there are a lot more gray lines over here with other Republicans, and Democrats have more gray lines over here, and there's starting to be a little gap in between. But if we fast forward to 2011, there's basically no connection. So Democrats only write Democratic bills, Republicans only write Republican bills, and there's very little crosstalk, very little co-sponsorship, and this is a relatively new phenomenon. This is something that's been growing for quite a while, but is most extreme now. So ideological segregation isn't just geographic, it's also seen in Congress, and here we have a nice little video showing what's happened in Congress, where, again, red dots, Republicans, blue dots, Democrats, and they've segregated themselves so that Democrats sit to the left side of the aisle, Republicans sit to the right side of the aisle. They have different caucuses. They don't interact with each other. In fact, Representative Henry Cuellar, Democrat from Texas, he once said that when he went to Congress for his first term, they have an orientation for all the new Congress people at the beginning of every Congress. And he walked onto the bus. He's very excited, young congressman, excited to make change in the world. And everybody on the bus got silent. And he said, "What? Do I have something on my face?" And he said, "No, this is the Republican bus. The Democratic bus is over there." So they literally said, "You can't sit on our bus. You're not welcome here. You can't talk to us. You can't ride with us. You're going somewhere else. You're not welcome." Okay, so again, those are the elites. So what about us? What about us regular people, us regular citizens? We can look at social media, and again, here we see this is from Twitter. So you have Democratic people on Twitter and Republican people on Twitter, and oftentimes they talk about politics, and oftentimes they're complaining about the other side. They're angry at the other side, but curiously, they're not actually talking to the other side. The other side isn't saying anything to anger them. We get ourselves fired up about the other side without ever talking to them or ever interacting with them. And you can see there's almost no connection here. And you can operationalize connection on Twitter by whether or not people are sending messages to each other, whether they are retweeting, like sharing the messages of people on the other side, and they really don't do that. We share messages of people that are like us, that believe similar things as us, and then we don't even see the stuff that the other side is saying. We can also find similar effects when we look at blogs. So you have liberal blogs, they write about liberal things and they cite other liberal blogs, but they never, they don't really interact with the conservative blogs. Same thing, conservatives don't really interact with the liberal blogs. So you have these two different perspectives that aren't talking to each other, there's no dialogue between them, and usually in these few cases where you see these lines connecting to some blog on the other side, they are making fun of them, or they are berating them. They are saying nasty things about them. So it's not even a genuine attempt to communicate. It's an attempt to undermine, usually, or caricature. And you can also think about media segregation. So there's a huge difference in the types of media that liberals consume versus what conservatives consume. Conservatives, about 50% of them prefer Fox News, and liberal media preferences are a little more disparate in that they prefer, like 15% prefer MSNBC, and another 15% prefer NPR, some CNN. So there's a little more diversity there, but in general, they're consuming different types of media. And those media, of course, have their own biases. Okay, now, hopefully this is somewhat convincing that we've segregated ourselves in many ways, geographically, ideologically, in terms of our internet behavior, our Congress people that we elect, they've segregated themselves even though we are electing them and then sending them to a single building where they're supposed to interact with each other. But we've segregated. And there's a lot that we know about the potential consequences of segregation. And this applies across pretty much any social identity. Now, if you think of segregation in the context of politics, if we don't know any conservatives, then it becomes way easier to dislike them. If we don't know any other liberals, it becomes way easier to dislike them. And that's exactly what we observe in the data. So the less contact we have with people in that other group, the easier it is for us to think, oh, they are terrible. And I and my team, awesome, best ever, tremendous. Or what's the, whatever the Trumpism is. But it's not limited to just how much we like or dislike our group versus the other group. It also extends to the policy positions that we hold. So we know that when we talk to people who share our viewpoint, we start gravitating outward. We become more extreme. So if I'm opposed to capital punishment and I only talk to other people who are opposed to capital punishment, they convince me. They're like, oh, it's even worse than you originally thought. So, oh, okay, yeah. And then I become even more opposed. Or if I favor it, then I become more in favor. It's like, oh yeah, I have to really punish that. It's like, whoa, okay. Just by talking to people who share our views, we start shifting out towards the extremes. And it's not just, say, capital punishment. It could be attitudes towards Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter, or gun control versus rights, abortion, same-sex marriage, trans bathroom usage, basically any issue. If you're surrounded by people that agree with you, you tend to become more extreme. And that makes it harder to have conversations with people on the other side, because it's not finding the similarities decrease as you become more and more extreme and further apart. Okay, so one thing that happens when we are segregated is that it leads to this emergence of different moral cultures. Now, the definition of moral or morality is broad and debatable, but there are some themes that a lot of people universally or around the world across many different cultures say, okay, this is a moral thing. And one thing that we see as a universal moral dimension is this idea of fairness. So everybody says fairness is a moral value, but there are differences in what we mean when we say fairness, particularly if you're liberal versus conservative. This is a nice cartoon that kind of characterizes the difference between liberal versus conservative ideas about fairness. So conservatives believe in fairness that is based on the equity principle. So we should all get exactly what we deserve. So if I work 5 hours, I should get paid for 5 hours of work. If somebody else is getting a little boost up, I need to get a little boost up, but we all get the same boost. Liberals, on the other hand, care more about equality-based fairness. So what they want is they want the same outcomes in the end. So if someone starts at a lower position, they need more help up. This person here who's really tall, he doesn't need any help up. This person who's already succeeding and was born into money, maybe they don't need as much help to succeed and excel in their lives. So these beliefs about fairness map onto these red and blue states pretty dramatically. Another thing that a lot of people will point to as being moral is this idea of respecting authority. And authority is a weird thing across the political divide. So liberals, they tend to value insubordination and disrespecting authority, whereas conservatives tend to think, okay, authority is a good thing, we should respect our parents, we should respect God's wishes, those kinds of things. And so there's also kind of the notions of sanctity and sacredness. And there's variability on this too. So in more conservative places, they value religious-based sanctity. So they get their moral code from holy books, religious books, whereas we have liberals who say, your body might be a temple, but mine's an amusement park. And they say nothing is sacred. Okay, so as we segregate in this way, we start having more and more divergent life experiences. So you look at a liberal community, you're going to find more hybrid cars on the road versus big SUVs. You'll also find a higher ratio of bookstores to gun stores, actually a really good predictor of how Republican or Democratic a community is going to be. You also see different types of churches. In more liberal places, you have spiritual but not religious people, you have Unitarian churches, or even this new finagled thing is atheist churches. Yeah, I don't know if you have one of those here yet, but they're coming. Versus more traditional Orthodox churches. You also even have very subtle things, like your buses might say Merry Christmas versus Happy Holidays. Television preferences even differ. So if you're in a more conservative place, most popular TV show, Duck Dynasty. I've never once watched Duck Dynasty. I live in Chicago. Modern Family, everybody watches Modern Family. And even music preferences differ in these places. So you have Lynyrd Skynyrd being way more popular in these red states than in blue states. And you have people like John Lennon who are way more popular in blue states than red states. And this also manifests in kind of curious experiences at stores and cafes where Starbucks CEO a bit ago said, okay, guns are not welcome in our store. This is a very blue kind of thing. It's based in Seattle. But in Texas, you have this barbecue restaurant saying gun-carrying customers get a discount at this restaurant. Firearms welcome. Please keep all weapons holstered unless the need arises. In such a case, judicious marksmanship is appreciated. This is characteristic of the differences that we see in red versus blue America. And what happens is we don't have relationships with people on the other side. So Representative Jim Leach from our neighboring Iowa once said, it becomes much easier to say nasty things about people when you know you don't have to face his or her family over the dinner table later on in the week. And that's something that used to happen in Congress until they changed the congressional schedule. They would argue all day long and then go out to drinks afterward, and they liked each other. We don't have that anymore. And there's a lot of research in social psychology that talks about why this is the case and how easily we form groups, and when we're segregated from other groups, even if you take 5-year-olds in this one particular experiment, or 5 or 10-year-olds, and you just put them into camps randomly. You randomly assign them to live in one cabin versus another, and then they start forming identities. They'll say, oh, we're the Eagles, we're the Rattlers, and then they start fighting with each other. This is a very basic tendency. We like being in groups, and we want our group to be better than other groups. And the moment that there's a hint of competition, this hostility starts growing. Okay, so what on earth can we do about this? hopefully we're not all super depressed and feeling helpless, because we're not helpless. There's a lot we can do, and it really starts with us. We can vote. You have a few weeks to get everything squared away and vote. And when we vote, we need to do some things like elect fewer hyper-partisans, because we are empowering these people that are promoting these extremist, hostile agendas. And at the state level, it'd be helpful to be trying to work on initiatives and referenda that allow for more open primaries, kind of different types of balloting so that it's like instant runoff voting, these kinds of things that have some evidence suggesting that they can reduce hyperpartisanship. Secondly, we need to do things that can try to weaken the pressure to be hyperpartisan, because right now we have a system in place where the people who get the powerful committee chairmanships in Congress are getting them based on how much they stick with their party and whether they're meeting their fundraising quotas. This is a new thing that emerged after the 1994 election, because prior to that, we just gave it to the person that was ranking member, the person that was the most senior member of that committee. Now it's all about money. And this has probably only gotten worse since Citizens United. So money is more and more important. And we need to do a lot to rebuild cross-party relationships. So this is something that would be more applied at Congress, but this is something that we can also do ourselves in our day-to-day lives. And when I say that, I mean we need to expand the us. So think of cases where people had strong disagreements on policies, but thought, okay, this person might not be evil. Maybe they have a valid concern, and maybe I don't agree with them, but I should at least try to understand them. There are a lot of organizations that are trying to bring together people of different beliefs, people of different parties, different religious groups, and promote these conversations, because they're hard. We don't like talking to people who think that we're crazy. We don't like talking to people who think that our beliefs are evil or wrong. So I would challenge you to try to have conversations with those people. Don't avoid them, because they exist. They're half of America, and we're not separating from them anytime soon. So try to expand to us. Try to have communication with people on the other side of the aisle. And when interacting with people with dissimilar beliefs, we should embrace the principle of charity. So don't assume the worst. Don't assume that they think you're an idiot. Don't assume that they think you're evil. Because oftentimes, we all care about issues and we all want the best for the country because we all live here. Our definitions of what the best is often different across ideological lines, but oftentimes, there is some overlap. There are commonalities. Debt's probably a problem. It is a problem. How do we resolve it? There are some ideas on the left and right that probably have to come together to resolve it, because it's a huge problem. So when people disagree, don't assume that they're wrong. Consider that they have a different perspective. Maybe they're living in a different community and their experience of the world is different from yours. Try to understand what that experience that they have is. And I would also recommend remembering Dale Carnegie's advice in this famous book from the 1920s. The only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it. Most people don't want to argue. And once you have started an argument, we go back, our minds move into a different mode. We are not trying to understand, we are trying to win. So we're not open to alternative ideas, we become less creative, we become more dogmatic when we're thinking in terms of arguing as opposed to discussing. Also, show respect for each other's opinions. It's not necessary that the other person's wrong. Sometimes they are, but not always. And we don't know unless we actually listen to them. If you're wrong, and you will be, I hope, maybe I'm projecting because I know I'm often wrong, but gotta be quick to admit it and say, yeah, well, you are totally right. I see your point of view. I don't know how I missed it. That's right. And people will start respecting you back for that. It's a reciprocal relationship. And whenever possible, begin in a friendly way. Just be nice, say hi. Don't assume the worst. And I'll conclude with an awesome quote from Abraham Lincoln when he said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory will swell again when touched, as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature." So I will say thank you. I'm looking forward to having a nice discussion with all of you, and hopefully some of you will hang out and talk to me more afterward.
Well, I disagree with Dale Carnegie. I think avoiding arguments is how we get into a lot of problems. I think the times are so critical. We have to really confront some really dangerous times that we're in. And I've talked to you beforehand and said that I was going to take the point of view that we're not so much polarized as distracted by argument, and so much stuff that really should be on the agenda of the main media and all of our lives is not talked about. It's avoided and not in the same fashion. But that's basically what I wanted you to confront. But yeah, I'll leave it at that and let somebody else step up too. Okay, so I want to say that it is definitely important to have discussions, but whether it's a discussion or a debate or an argument, that feels like something different. So if it's an argument, the goal is to convince you that I'm right. If it's a discussion, it's figuring out what is right. So earlier you mentioned the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, and I think it's critical that we talk about it. But it's not going to be that effective if we're just yelling past each other, saying, "Oh, you're wrong, and that's evil, and you're stupid," which is kind of where our debate is. It's not actually debating policy. If you listen to, especially the first two debates, there was almost no exchange of policy. And I just watched so C-SPAN showed the Obama-Romney debates, and it was the clip of Romney saying, "They brought me binders full of women." And at the time, if you're like me, I was like, "Oh, this is terrible." But now it's like, "Oh, that seems like nothing." And if you actually watch these debates just from 4 years ago, they are talking about policy. So they have these different perspectives like, okay, we need to change taxes this way. No, we need to change taxes this way. At no point were they attacking each other saying, "Oh, you're the Antichrist," or "You are not American," or "You're a criminal," or "If I lose, I'm going to refute the entire outcome of the election." So it's really important to discuss these issues. But while we're discussing them, we need to have an open mind and try to actually understand them as opposed to just advance our particular viewpoint.
I guess a question that came up for me as you were talking was most all of the issues or things that you were referring to that demonstrates the segregation and separation, and then issues of cause. I mean, those are more, it seemed like a lot of stating the problem, and I never really have a good feeling here about understanding what's the cause. I mean, all of those seem like markers of the partisanship, so the segregation, I mean, all the things you mentioned. And it's a nice analysis, and I appreciate that. But I guess I'm feeling cause-wise, I still don't understand very well, and I don't know when you go back in history and look at how things were at one time much worse, and then they got better, and then they got worse. If there's a way for us to in some way use some of that information to look at cause.
Yeah, so it's really tricky identifying cause for these very complicated issues. In particular, for the segregation component, I've studied migration patterns. And what we find is that when people live in communities where they're surrounded by people that are different from them, they feel like they don't belong, and then they're disproportionately likely to migrate to a new place. And when you look at the places where they do migrate, they tend to be more similar to their political values. And this is related to kind of a broader phenomenon that's seen across the world, where we want to be around people that are more similar to us across all kinds of identities. And there's been some research in post-apartheid South Africa where they show that even though there's no legal segregation down there, the Afrikaners and the natives, they use different parts of the beaches. If you look at even networks within communities, so neighborhoods within a city, you find that there's much more density of particular religious groups or ethnic groups. So Jewish people tend to cluster at a rate that's like something like 400 times what you would expect by chance. So we tend to surround ourselves with people that are similar to us, and this just seems to be one application, politics seems to be one application of that tendency.
So if that situation is true, you'd expect it ever gets worse and worse and worse. But it changes, right? You show that one graph. So I guess the issue is what pushes the change? When things get better or when it ends. Yeah, maybe that's what, maybe it is some war or some major kind of either global or federal, national upset. But it seems like there's a natural movement with what you're saying that would get things worse, 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 and more extreme. But somehow something intervenes and changes that. Those seem like interesting things. Maybe they're natural events and not man-made events, and intentional events.
So lots of good stuff in there. One piece is that we saw the lowest levels of polarization and hostility right around World War II, in the wake of World War II, and as the Cold War was getting started. So generally when we have this, what we call, in psychology we call a superordinate threat, but basically it's a threat that affects all groups. So it affects all Americans regardless of your left or right. It forces us to cooperate more, and it makes us more tolerant of working with the other side than when we don't have that threat. And you can see that a little bit right after 9/11, because George Bush's approval rating on September 9th, 2001 was about 50%. On September 13th, it was 90%. So, and there's broad bipartisan support for the Iraq War, for the Patriot Act, for lots of post-9/11 legislation. So that is one piece of the puzzle. The second piece is that really since the 1970s, politics has changed. Our partisanship is not just about our party identification anymore, because presumably that just tell us how people vote. But now it tells us the kind of car people drive. It tells us the types of churches that they go to or not go to. It tells us what TV shows they watch and what music they listen to. So it's expanded to include not just politics, but also our lifestyles.
One of the things, one of the things I was going to share is this. You mentioned discussion and debate, but not dialogue, because the intergroup relations research literature shows that, and that Roberts Cave was an example of that, that when they decided to bring the kids together with a task, then they united. And that kind of relates to what you were talking about before, like the wars and the different things like that, 9/11. However, I think what the research shows is that when people have connection and they, talk across or with each other, then that tends to reduce some of the disparities and some of the animosities. And that's one way to break down some of the barriers. So I just wanted to share that.
Yes, that's exactly right. The original theory was that just contact in general, so interacting with people of other groups, would promote better interactions with them. But there are some other conditions that have to be met too. So in the Roberts Cave studies, they actually had to have a shared goal. So they had to pool their money to be able to rent a movie, or one of the wells for water was broken. So they had to work together to transport the water, or else nobody got water. So when you have these forced shared goals, and you have kind of more positive casual contact with people rather than kind of like this forced integration, which it often doesn't work. I mean, there are now some new books coming out about segregated schools post Brown v. Board that are still facing a lot of problems.
I have a question about, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal this last Sunday that said that the big boom in America, ended in '73, the post-war boom, and that we've not really had a roaring economy since then. And is that a reason why we may, there are people that are suffering, that are, it used to be that you could have a good job in furniture, in a steel mill, in a car plant, and your income was good enough for you. Is it that factor, or is it because we have polarized media?
Polarized what?
Both. In other words,
media. Okay.
We're watching Fox or we're watching MSNBC, and we get different facts.
Yes, so I think the answer is yes. It's both. Certainly there are frustrations that people have because they used to have jobs that paid well and they could live a comfortable middle-class life, and those are gone. And it's hard to figure out how to make them come back or create replacements for them. So there are certainly frustrations that are linked to that. There's growing inequality, and you can kind of see this conflict between the Tea Party and what was Occupy Wall Street, and now just kind of a broader movement on the left saying, oh, well, we got to crush the 1% and have more progressive tax policy to basically address this growing inequality, because it's increased a lot in the last 2 decades, especially that top 1%. Like people that work in the financial sector have increased their incomes thousands of times, and the people on the bottom have not. So that's certainly a problem. And then media fractionation and being able to choose media that tells us what we want to hear, that is a huge problem too, because we can't even agree on the facts anymore. And oftentimes we talk past each other. We understand issues in very different ways. And then when we understand them in different ways, we talk about them in different ways. And when somebody is trying to tell us how they understand an issue, it's like, what are they talking about? It doesn't make sense. Let me make this more concrete. So in the wake of the most recent Great Recession, you had people advocating 2 different approaches. So we need to extend unemployment benefits, expand unemployment benefits. And that makes good sense if you live in a big city or in a manufacturing town, because there, unemployment was skyrocketing, 20, 25% sometimes. But if you live in a farming community, if you live in a more rural place, unemployment went from 4.6% to 4.7%. And they're like, what are you talking about? We're broke. We can't spend billions on extending unemployment benefits. We need farm subsidies. We need things that are going to help us. So you have these 2 sides that are experiencing the world in very different ways. And the solution to fixing the problems one side sees are very different from the solutions that you'd need for fixing the other side's issues. So as we've segregated into these communities, these enclaves, it's harder and harder to kind of facilitate these conversations because they see different problems and they don't see the facts on the other side either.
Okay. I think people before me have asked similar questions, directions. My question is, can you tell us, your study, what's your focus in your study? Just want to identify, describe the situation. What do you see? Can you identify the causes, the issues? Or do you see this phenomena just like human nature? But if you don't see it as normal, when I say normal, that means it's a human nature. And then if you see some cause this, and then if you could identify these major causes, and then are you going to offer solutions, how to improve it or change the situation? Thanks.
So I've been studying kind of a lot of the causes that make these interactions go poorly, and It keeps going back to living in these different places and having very different experiences, because when you lack shared experiences, it's way harder to interact with the people on the other side. Now, I think that a big part of this is human nature, because we like being around people that are similar to us. We like being around people that think that we're smart and we have the correct viewpoints on things. So in some ways, that it is human nature to divide into groups where people around us like us and we like them. Now, that's not to say that there aren't things that we can do, and a lot of them are tricky because they require lots of institutional changes. Like, I think one simple one at the institutional level is changing the congressional schedule. So in 1994, we switched to a 3-day schedule. So they fly in Tuesday, they do whatever they do for 2 days, and then Thursday they fly home. This is in contrast to when they used to live in Washington, and they would have to interact with each other and work all the time. So I think if we change the congressional schedule so it's 3 weeks on, 1 week off, as opposed to 2 or 3 days on and then 4 days off every week, we'll promote better dialogue there. And then also at the individual level, we gotta work on having relationships with people that think differently from us, because as much as I like my viewpoints, I'm not so bold to think that they're absolutely correct. And I find that the more I talk to people that have different viewpoints, I feel like my views become more nuanced and I understand the other side better. And it feels, as an academic, I like understanding. So that's fun, even though it's often uncomfortable. So we have to kind of get over this discomfort of challenging our views and encountering people that will challenge our views, because they might have valid points and we don't know unless we talk to them. So I would say try to have relationships outside of our comfortable liberal or conservative bubbles.
Yes, I'm curious. So one of the things, the sort of existential threat, it seems like global warming is an opportunity to do that, although it seems to be one of those things that also tears us apart. But I'm curious, other solutions that might be out there. I know there's a talk now about trying to focus on redistricting so that we don't gerrymander by our political views and sort of separate us out, so that if you're running for office, you have to appeal to a broader set of viewpoints. Curious what you think of that as a possible impact on this. And then the last thing is, are there organizations that are doing interesting work on this that seem to be having some impact or insight into it?
So I'll answer your last question first, and then hopefully remember all the first ones second. First, there are lots and lots of organizations, and every month it seems like there's another organization with a similar goal. There's the National Institute for Civil Discourse, which was founded by George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, and they are funding lots and lots of research, and they have a media outreach team that is trying to promote better dialogue across issues. And there's the Village Square, which is a national organization, but they have lots of, they're localized in different states, but they are in many states now. And what they do is they have monthly events where they bring together people of different religious traditions or different political traditions, and then they talk about some kind of issue once a month. And my organization, Civil Politics, we work with these types of organizations. We design interventions and then measure the effectiveness of them, so that we can try to understand, well, what are the little things you can do to a situation to allow people to be more comfortable having these difficult conversations. And oftentimes, if you just start by learning about the person, so you get to know their family, you get to know some of the things that they actually like, you find that you have some things in common, and then later on you realize, oh, we disagree on capital punishment. Okay. You seem like a reasonable person. Why do we disagree? And then people are more open to listening to what that person has to say from that point. So there are lots and lots of organizations that are working towards promoting better relationships across people that ordinarily won't interact. And I think that those will be very important. What was the first? Redistricting, yes. So Iowa has one of the least partisan redistricting policies in the country, and they're also generally one of the most civil states in the country. Now, this is confounded with the fact that Iowa is not a very diverse state. Lots of farmers and not a lot of multicultural identities there. So it's probably easier for them to have greater civility because there are just less voices, less perspectives going on. But that is a promising approach. And there are other election tools that can be used. Like California has tried rank order voting, and this can allow for less partisan people to get in, because conceivably people on the other side might rank people on your side as like their second or third choice, and then you might end up, but they probably wouldn't rank like the most partisan extreme person on your side as their second choice. So that opens the door for greater power to less polarized, less partisan people.
So you mentioned that, can you hear me? So you mentioned that money is more important than ever for our political system right now. And we have these really wealthy industries that's funding these think tanks that come up with scientific research that favors their outcome. And because they're so wealthy, they kind of control the political system. And how do you think we could stray away from this funding cycle in our system?
So we used to have federally funded presidential elections. We technically still have them, but the amount of money candidates can raise now is so far greater than that, that it's hard to say, okay, don't accept donations, here's $60 million, make it last for 14 months or however long the cycle is going to be. So I think if we have more restrictions on campaign donations, if we at least require that people put their names on their donations as opposed to donating a check to some mysterious organization that doesn't have to report who gave the money or for what purpose, and they can use it however they want. I think that would certainly help, because when you are anonymous, you can, you don't really feel pressured to behave or be nice or do anything that we ordinarily would do in our day-to-day lives. But if your name is on something, then you're more likely to behave in a way that is more acceptable and nice and respectful. So I think reforming campaign finance is really important, and Citizens United is a problem because it allows for this dark money, and we don't know who's donating what, and there's basically unlimited spending in politics now, and money is speech. So that leads to money being more and more important.
We're going to take one more question.
I guess I still have a question, and that is, what can we do, or is there an issue between urban, suburban areas and rural areas who have very different lifestyles or expectations?
Could you say more?
Just here in Illinois, there's a big difference between the perception of things in Chicago and the northern suburbs than there is in downstate Illinois. Part
Sure.
of that is economic, and
Yes.
Isn't that not a factor in this increasing polarization?
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, as long as we are living in these different places, we face different issues. So that's inevitable. But I would argue that just because we have these different experiences and we disagree on what the most important issues are, it doesn't mean that we would necessarily have to yell or bite somebody's finger off if they disagree with us. So I think that if we can promote these relationships between people, then we're able to realize, okay, the needs that we have up in Chicago are different from the needs that you have here. So if Governor Rauner passes a budget, that budget could conceivably have some things to help us pay for more police and some of the things that we need in Chicago, but might also be able to put some things in that budget that address some of the concerns that we have here down in Southern Illinois. So I think when we start having these relationships and assuming the other side might actually have a valid concern or a valid need, then it becomes easier to make concessions to them. Because if we assume that they're good and reasonable, then there's no reason not to.
I'd say please join me in thanking Matt one more time.